Prior to Aegon's conquest, and for most of its long and storied history, Westeros was made up of dozens of petty kingdoms, usually consisting of a few towns and castles. Occasionally, and more frequently over time, one of these petty kingdoms would grow and consume those around it until it became a powerful, fully fledged kingdom in its own right. In 2 BC, as Aegon looked across Blackwater Bay from Dragonstone, this is exactly what he saw. Several large kingdoms stuck in a never-ending cycle of war for dominance over the others. As quickly as one kingdom rose, it would fall again, just as fast. While the kings of Westeros fought amongst themselves, Aegon Targaryen waited for the right moment to strike and take them all by surprise and capture the kingdoms of Westeros in the name of House Targaryen. Looking back at how history has played out, the statement makes it seem like this was always going to be an easy task, especially with the firepower dragons offered Aegon. But as fragmented as these kingdoms were, they still had the manpower, resources and motivation to put up a fierce fight. The Lannisters make enemies easily, but have a harder time keeping friends. Harlden to John Connington, A Dance with Dragons Chapter 61, The Griffin Reborn. The kings of House Lannister had ruled the Westerlands for thousands of years after taking Casterly Rock from the last Casterly. Due to the sheer amount of gold they've been able to mine from Casterly Rock, the Lannisters were by far the richest house in all of the realm, and thus were able to muster a huge army to defend their kingdom. Not only that, but they were one of the few kingdoms outside of the Iron Islands who were able to field a large and effective navy that was mostly used to protect trade in and out of Lannisport from Ironborn raids. They also used this wealth as a means to expand their new kingdom, and over thousands of years had warred with near on every single one of their neighbouring kingdoms, including the Gardener Kings of the Reach, the Storm Kings in the east, and a number of petty river kings. The king at the time of the conquest was King Loren Lannister. While we know little about his reign prior to the conquest, we do know that he managed to maintain a short period of peace with the Kings of the Reach, House Gardener, after what has been speculated as decades of bloody border conflicts. It's hard to say if he was allies with Gardener at this point, or if indeed the arrival of Aegon, which saw these historic enemies join their forces. Even before the alliance with the Gardeners, in a straight-up battle with the Lannister army, Aegon, without the use of his dragons, would have struggled to win the day, not even being close to matching the number of men the kings of the West could call upon. The winters are hard, but the Starks will endure. We always have. Eddard Stark to Robert Baratheon, A Game of Thrones Chapter 4, Eddard 1. The north of Westeros was ruled by the Kings of Winter, House Stark, for thousands of years, as far back as the first main kingdoms forged in the wake of the Long Night. The kings in the north very rarely became embroiled with the wars of the southern kingdoms, especially after the coming of the Andals. That does not mean, however, that House Stark's hold on the north was never challenged in those thousands of years. Before they controlled the entirety of the north, the Starks were constantly warring with the kings of House Bolton, whom controlled large sections of the north. The wars between the houses would be bloody and brutal. During the coming of the Andals, the Starks and the Boltons did form an uneasy alliance as they attempted to push back the invaders. House Stark also managed to subjugate the rival Barrow Kings and Marsh Kings, giving them total dominion of the north after they defeated the Boltons. They would still often war with raiders from the Iron Islands on their western coast, as well as working with the Night's Watch to deal with wildling incursions from beyond the wall. At the time of Aegon's conquest, King Torrhen Stark ruled the north from Winterfell and was able to field around 30,000 men. While not the largest army the kings of Westeros could field, the Northmen had a reputation as fierce fighters who would fight bravely and without fear. You need to come south. You need to taste the summer before it flees. In Highgarden there are fields of golden roses that stretch away as far as the eye can see. The fruits are so ripe they explode in your mouth. Melons, peaches, fire plums. You've never tasted such sweetness. King Robert Baratheon to Eddard Stark. A Game of Thrones Chapter 4, Eddard 1. The Gardener Kings of the Reach are perhaps the oldest kingdom in Westeros, with House Gardener descending from the first king of the First Men, the legendary Garth Greenhand. The Reach is known as the breadbasket of Westeros, growing food that feeds near every kingdom, and in turn, the kings of the Reach at times have neared the wealth of House Lannister. The Kingdom of the Reach would often fight wars with the Lannister kings and the Storm Kings of House Durrandon. However, they also had to contend with the incursions from the Dornish to the south in the Dornish marches around the Red Mountains, with frequent attacks on towns and villages, with some bold enough to attack Old Town itself. While border wars were common, it does seem that Mern the Ninth Gardener had established a peaceful coexistence with King Loren Lannister. The Reach contains Old Town, the seat of House Hightower, which at this time was the largest city and most important port in Westeros, which allowed the economy of the Reach to thrive to an extent the Gardener kings were able to mint their own coinage prior to Aegon's conquest. It's not wholly clear, but it is safe to assume that the other larger kingdoms had their own currencies prior to the conquest, until they were unified into one single realm under the control of House Targaryen. Being the breadbasket of Westeros, they were able to keep their troops fed. With this alliance with Loren Lannister, the two could field an army with a minimum of 50,000 men. In most normal wars, that number of men would be near unbeatable, but this wasn't going to be a normal war, and King Mern had vastly underestimated the threat of House Targaryen to his peril. You may burn us, my lady, but you will not bend us, break us, or make us bow. This is Dorne. You are not wanted here. Return at your peril. Mira Martell to Rhaenys Targaryen. The World of Ice and Fire, The Reign of the Dragons, The Conquest. Out of all of the kingdoms of Westeros, prior to the conquest, Dorne was by far the most politically stable and united. Like every other kingdom in Westeros, Dorne was initially made up of several petty kingdoms, during both the Age of Heroes and the coming of the Andals, but in around 700 BC, Mors Martell, head of House Martell, at the time one of the smaller houses in Dorne, married the Rhoynish warrior queen Nymeria, who had led her people to Dorne on a long, perilous journey, seeking refuge after the Rhoynish wars all but destroyed her people. With the settling of the Rhoynar in Dorne, House Martell was able to bring the whole kingdom under its control very quickly, with it remaining so ever since. The Dornish often war with the kingdoms of the Reach and Stormlands on their northern borders past the Red Mountains. However, rather than full-scale wars, they are much more likely to send smaller raiding parties into the Dornish marches. It was difficult for the Reachmen and the Stormlanders to strike back in the harsh terrain of Dorne, with it being either mountainous or a never-ending desert. Without the knowledge of the Dornish, it's near impossible to cross, with many armies becoming lost in its sands. The Dornish often proved hard to fight, avoiding pitched battles, favouring hit-and-run and guerrilla warfare tactics that used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. The Dornish are also incredibly proud people, and with Dorne being the only kingdom the Rhoynar settled, are often united in their ideals. Thus, conquering Dorne was always going to prove a challenge, holding it more so, a lesson Aegon would learn to his detriment during the conquest. For the most part, the Kingdom of the Vale under House Arryn was one of the more stable kingdoms of Westeros, with much of this down to the natural geography, making the Vale easy to defend and harder to attack, thanks to the mountainous terrain and high cliffs along the coastline. But one huge issue for the kings of the Vale, House Arryn, was their king. Ronald Arryn was a small child who came to his throne at his father's sudden death. Thus the Vale was being ruled by his mother, Shara Arryn, as Queen Regent, until he came of age. While by all accounts Shara was a competent ruler and did a fine job managing the kingdom for her son, the fact the king was a child and the Vale ruled by a woman in the eyes of more arrogant and misguided foes might make the Vale seem weak and a prime target. Even so, the Lords of the Vale were behind Shara, and it would be no easy task for a traditional invading army to take the Vale. But that's the thing. Aegon and his sisters didn't just have an army, they had dragons, which would make all the Vale's impregnable natural defences all but useless. At the time of the conquest, Stormlands had been ruled for thousands of years by House Durrandon, and like with most kingdoms over that time, it rose and fell, then rose again, through an endless cycle of war and peace, with the neighbouring kingdoms, specifically the Reach and Westerlands, and to some extent Dorne. When he was a boy, King Argilac managed to turn back a Dornish invasion, and countless raids into the marches. Then, towards the end of the Century of Blood, he joined the Great Alliance against the Tigers from Volantis, and led a host into the disputed lands, being one of the few Westerosi kings we know to have done so. he marched against an army from Volantis, which was attempting to retake Myr. 20 years later, he killed King Gar the Seventh Gardener in a battle of Summerfield. He began to look north to expand his borders into the area that would become known as the Crownlands, but in doing so he would be at odds with the mightiest of the kings of Westeros. Harrenhal, better known in the history books as Harren the Black, the king of the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, who too was looking to expand his kingdom into the Crownlands. Thus a border dispute and war between the two kingdoms was bound to happen sooner or later. The power of Harren cannot be understated. He controlled not just the Iron Islands, but the Riverlands, with the Riverlands being vital in moving trade across the Seven Kingdoms, with the Trident being its lifeblood. Over the last 2 generations, his forefathers had worked to create this kingdom that would be known as the Kingdom of the Isles and Rivers, with Harren ruling it at its apex. He ruled with fear, and while he was not loved by his people, he ruled effectively. For most of his life, he had been building a new monstrous castle on the banks of the God's Eye, using the resources of the Iron Islands and Riverlands to build it. None of the other kings of Westeros had the power individually to face Harren, given the scale of his kingdom and the amount of men he could call upon. But Harren's brutal way of ruling had started to cause resentment back on the Iron Islands. While Harren claimed to be Ironborn first and foremost, he only visited the Isles a handful of times, and mostly to exploit its resources and manpower to further expand his growing kingdom. With Harrenhal at the centre of his realm, and some had begun to question exactly how Ironborn Harren truly was. With Harrenhal at the centre of his realm, there's no telling what Harren could achieve, and how much land he could take from the other kingdoms. Westeros had been in a cycle of war and peace, growth and decline, and infighting amongst its kings for generations. It was unstable, with borders shifting constantly. None of this was conducive to growth, and ultimately it was the small folk who would suffer. All it would take is one single spark to light the fuse that would send these kings of Westeros into chaos. Aegon would light that flame. Something that is very often pointed out by fans is one of Aegon's motivations for invading Westeros, especially before the addition of the prophecy in House of the Dragon, might be a virtuous one. That he wanted to end the never-ending cycle of war between the kingdoms and bring stability and growth to the people of Westeros. While we can't exactly prove this idea or even disprove it, the irony with it is that when you take a step back and look at the 289-year reign of House Targaryen, did things really get better? Yes, new cities rose and infrastructure was greatly improved, especially by the likes of King Jaehaerys. But ultimately, was there less war? What replaced the border wars of these 7 kingdoms was multiple uprisings, rebellions, and several civil wars between members of House Targaryen. I suspect this might be by design, given George R. R. Martin's well-known anti-war sentiment, and the general tone of the books in general, with their attitude towards war. For me, the most interesting part of this pre-conquest Westeros is Harrenhal and the sheer potential of his growing kingdom. At the time of the conquest, he controlled both the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, with one eye on the area that will become the Crownlands. I suspect if he had gone to war with Arglak Durridon over the Crownlands, he likely would have had the manpower and resources to win it. While I doubt Harren could have taken all of Westeros in his lifetime, the same way Aegon the Conqueror did, I do think it's possible that if Aegon had not looked west and invaded, Harren and his descendants could have in time taken perhaps the Reach and the Stormlands, and potentially the Westerlands, if he'd battled them all one at a time. But if they formed some alliance against him, however, it might have been a very different story. I don't think he would have been fool enough to try and take Dorne, and I do suspect the North could have held them off, or made the war too difficult, such as the Dornish could have done. Now, it clearly wouldn't have been as easy as Aegon's conquest, and would have taken much longer, but it is possible that House Hall could have become some sort of High King for most of Westeros. For me, the biggest sign that Harren held these wider ambitions is Harrenhal itself. I think it was meant to be his Red Keep, a huge castle at the centre of Westeros to rule his huge kingdom from. In the end, while I suspect that it is possible, and there is some merit to this idea, Harren or his descendants really would have had trouble holding on to a larger kingdom. Even House Targaryen with their dragons didn't have it easy keeping the Seven Kingdoms together, and it took decades of politics and careful planning to integrate Westeros into a single united kingdom. And I don't think time would have been on Harren and House Horse's side before this larger kingdom crumbled and fragmented, and the cycle of the petty kingdoms would start again.